Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Value of Clinical Pathways in an Evidence-Based, Vertically Integrated Health System with Dr. James Weese. I'm Mackenzie Bean, Managing Editor with Becker's Hospital Review, and I'll be your moderator for today's presentation. We'll start with a brief introduction of Dr. Weese from Sonali Fonseca, Commercial Vice President of Elsevier's Clinical Path Solution. Dr. Weese will then share his experience using oncology pathways across Aurora Cancer Care, and will conclude with a 15-minute Q&A from you, our audience. Please submit your questions in the chat throughout the presentation, and we'll try to get through as many at the end as possible. Without further ado, I'll now turn the floor over to Sonali.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Hello, everybody. My name is Sonali Fonseca, and I have commercial responsibility for Elsevier's Oncology Pathways Solution. You may know us as VIA Oncology or as our recently rebranded name, Clinical Path. I am pleased to be here today to introduce Dr. Jim Weese, who is the Vice President of Aurora Cancer Care at Advocate Aurora Health, and who also serves as the Clinical Adjunct Professor of Surgery at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. Dr. Weese has previously held a number of prestigious roles in oncology and surgery at Advocate Christ, the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey, Cooper Hospital, Graduate Hospital, and Fox Chase Cancer Center. From the Philadelphia Academy of Surgery, and has been featured in the 27th edition of Who's Who in the East, as well as the 54th edition of Who's Who in America. In addition to these professional accolades, Dr. Weese is a true pioneer in the way he approaches cancer care. His commitment to innovation and his focus on building a strong team has resulted in Aurora's patients receiving incredible care right in their communities. Dr. Weese is also a personal inspiration to me and our Clinical Path team. Dr. Weese, thank you for your support and guidance over the years. Let me now turn it over to you to discuss how pathways have supported evidence-based care across Aurora's vertically integrated cancer center.
Thank you very much, Sonali. I appreciate the kind introduction, and certainly my one-year-old granddaughter would be very impressed. Hello, everybody. I am Dr. James Weese. I'm a retired hepatobiliary surgeon, and for the last 8+ years, I've served as Vice President of Aurora Cancer Care. And I'd like really to give you a brief overview to start of what Aurora Cancer Care is. We see approximately 8,700 newly diagnosed cancer patients a year, which is basically 1 in every 4 patients in Wisconsin diagnosed with cancer. We have 154 oncology physicians. Many of them are the surgeons who treat cancer, including a few who are specialized in surgical oncology. We have 19 medical oncology sites, 11 radiation oncology treatment locations. With a National Cancer Institute NCORP grant, we are very active in clinical trials, have currently about 187 clinical trials in oncology with over 1,100 enrolled patients. With our tracking of cancer patients and survivors for many years, we have nearly 80,000 patients being followed. And with our merger with Advocate Healthcare 3 years ago, we have essentially doubled the size of the cancer program to now between 18,000 and 19,000 new cancers a year. On today's presentation, I'd really like to focus on 3 themes. One is the development of an evidence-based, vertically multidisciplinary approach to cancer in a vertically integrated healthcare system. I want to talk about the metrics that we currently use and the value received from utilizing clinical pathways, and talk about additional initiatives currently in place to deliver patient-centric care, particularly in the COVID and post-COVID days as well as with the new CMS requirements. First, I'd like to talk about the development of our multidisciplinary approach to cancer and how Aurora Cancer Care developed and implemented this new model. One of the things that I think probably should be clarified first is the difference between pathways and guidelines. Pathways really give a prescribed recommendation of how patients should be treated as far as the sequencing of therapy and the type of treatment that they are offered. Pathway guidelines, such as NCCN, are much broader in that they give you a whole listing of a number of types of treatment that can be successfully used in treating cancer patients, but they really don't specify the order in which these should be prioritized. When I first came to Aurora, it was unclear as far as the amount of variation in chemotherapy delivery that was being given by our medical oncologists. One of my early tasks was to query our director of medical oncology, and as an example, I asked him how many different algorithms were being used for first-line treatment in stage 2 breast cancer. Aurora sees about 1,300 new breast cancers a year, and I figured that this would give us a good example of what we were working with. He thought about it for a while, and he told me he thought 6, possibly 8 different treatments were commonly used, but certainly not many more than that. So being a surgeon by history, I called the IT people and asked them to print off all of the first-line treatments, printing each one only once, that had been used during the last several years. I was a little surprised when I got a box of papers that actually looked like close to a ream of paper. And when I started going through them and confirming that there were indeed only one treatment selection per page, I stopped counting at 40 when we barely got through a quarter of the box. In trying to standardize treatment across a large, diverse health system and to provide patients with the best care possible, we wanted to eliminate as much variation as we could in the selection of therapy. More importantly, since progress is made by clinical trials, we wanted to be sure that with a large number of patients that we had, that we would be able to utilize our data to document treatment and treatment results with a large number of patients being treated in a similar manner. When we first got into this and we presented the data to our medical oncologists, there was some disbelief that they could possibly be using that many different pathways until when we showed them the evidence, they agreed that perhaps pathways would be a good way for us to standardize treatment. Pathways, again, are an evidence-based clinical decision support tool that's integrated into the clinical workflow. Our system uses Epic as an electronic health record, and we have been able to integrate the pathways directly into Epic for the patients to be managed directly off the doctor's schedule, so that it's become a very easy process to run them through the pathway determination. When we looked at a number of the pathways programs that were available, we had several distinct requirements. One, we felt it was important that the pathways be determined certainly by evidence, but selected by both academic and community-based oncologists. A number of the pathways companies have been developed by insurance companies, and there was a lot of concern that the treatments would be defined best by cost rather than by efficacy or toxicity. We wanted to find pathways that were effective, safe, and cost-efficient. We wanted to be able to have serious discussions among the different oncologists and come to consensus on the best ways to recommend treatment. We felt it was very important to prioritize clinical trials in the development of treatment pathways that we were using, and we also wanted them to be flexible enough to rapidly incorporate changes based on any new evidence or updated care standards that came out of organizations like ASCO. So as we looked at a number of different pathways, we actually found that in those days, via oncology pathways, now known as clinical path, were the ones that met most of our needs. We were particularly impressed that they could be integrated into the order sets of the electronic health record. The Pathways company had set up 14 disease-specific groups, each co-chaired by an academic and a community oncologist. These groups met virtually online every quarter, and at that point, treatments were discussed that would be ranked based on efficacy, then toxicity, and then on cost, so that we felt that we would be able to give treating physicians the optimal choices for evidence-based care. In addition, when available, we were always able to prioritize a clinical trial as the first option. One of the agreements that we had with the company was that if major changes in the field came out, that they could incorporate changes into the pathway. The agreement was within 35 working days, although realistically, any changes that we have instituted generally appear within 10 days to 2 weeks. In our system, we have a truly multidisciplinary team approach so that all patients really get the benefit knowing that cancer is a multidisciplinary disease by input from medical oncology, surgical oncology, radiation oncology, and interventional oncology. In addition, Aurora put together 8 quality committees, which looks at a number of parameters that are followed for treatment improvement on a yearly basis. So that we have put together a system to ensure quality care with input from all of the disciplines. In addition, even before COVID, we had put together high-definition video capability so that all of the medical oncologists, the surgical oncologists, and many of the radiation oncologists had access to video conferencing either in the centers where they worked or from their desktop computers. We also established 14 weekly disease-specific conferences, 5 of them being breast cancer because of the large number of breast patients that we saw, but the others all unimodality, all uni-disease pathways programs, so that the physicians from the entire system would be able to present their newly diagnosed cases for consideration for treatment from across the system. The other thing that we found is because in a large system such as ours, Aurora itself has 16 hospitals, and now with the addition of 9 Advocate hospitals with 25 different locations, it doesn't make sense to have quaternary care capability at all places. But with the NCORP grant, we are able to offer patients treatment literally very close to where they live, knowing that they may have to travel for the higher intensity surgical oncology cases where they are done at the quaternary or tertiary care hospitals, which have full-time intensivists and operating rooms that can handle multiple disciplines, that stereotactic radiosurgery is available, and we are well equipped to do robotic surgery as well as brachytherapy at many, but not all locations within the health system. By having these large multidisciplinary conferences, which are attended on a weekly basis with an average attendance between 25 and 40 clinicians, we are able to truly give patients a multidisciplinary approach to their disease, along with the pathways that are available within the electronic medical medical record. The conferences allow the oncologists across specialties to collaborate and devise the best treatment available for a specific patient. And by having the evidence-based pathways integrated into the electronic medical record, it serves as another checkpoint to ensure consistent treatment for the patients. As it turned out, the ability of having virtual conferencing was extremely helpful in allowing us to convert to a very safe environment across the time that COVID was most rampant in the country. We also found that it was imperative to introduce clinical trials with availability to as many patients as possible when it was clinically appropriate. The pathways allowed us to prioritize clinical trials which were available throughout the system with the NCORP grant. And in fact, with the introduction of pathways, excuse me, and the NCORP grant, within the first 2 years, our clinical trials volume went up by about 400% from the pre-pathway and NCORP experience. If a physician decided to decline a clinical trial, we required them to give us a reason, and those could be the patient didn't meet criteria, the patient refused, and they were even allowed to say that they disagreed with the trial and didn't want to enter a patient on it. We did find some very interesting metrics which we have used to look at the advantage of utilizing clinical pathways, which I think have given us some of the most compelling results. Again, because of our large number of breast cancer patients, we first looked at on-pathway patient treatment versus off-pathway patient treatment in stage 2 breast cancer. And we found a highly significant difference in the cost of treating these patients either on-pathway or off-pathway, with an off-pathway cost averaging over $200,000, and on-pathway being approximately $111,000. We then also looked at patients with advanced stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer, and we similarly found a significant difference in cost between on-pathway and off-pathway rates. So in treating these patients, the on-pathway cost averaged 104,500 compared to over 183,000 for off-pathway. When we first looked at the original compliance of using pathways, within 3 months of when we went live, at that time we had 42 medical oncologists, again 19 treatment sites. We averaged between 85 and 92% of patients, depending on the disease, who were treated on pathway. Again, our clinical trial utilization was enhanced by the use of pathways. In the year and a half before we went on pathways, there were 122 patients enrolled in clinical trials. In the next 9 months, we found that we had 102 patients who were enrolled, and our numbers have cascaded up since then. What we have continued to find with pathways is not that the pathways themselves are as great a significant money saver across all diseases and stages, but we have found that it significantly decreases the variation in cost in treating patients with a given stage of disease. And this has been consistently held up across a number of disease sites. In addition, I'd like to talk with you about some of the other initiatives that we've had that really allow us to provide patient-centered care. These are 2 programs we're going to be talking about. One is the Call Us First campaign, and 2 is our Nurse Navigator program. Call Us First campaign really was introduced in a response to the CMS program trying to reduce the number of patients who came into the emergency department or readmitted after chemotherapy. When we first analyzed the data, we found that many of the patients who showed up in the emergency room came in because of complaints of pain. And as you might imagine, when a patient on chemotherapy shows up in the emergency room, there's a decided push to get them out of the emergency room, and oftentimes the easiest way to do that is to admit them, both of which would be quite costly to the healthcare system. We also were quite surprised when we found out that the vast majority of these patients came in during office hours. So we put together a campaign that was developed by our excellent nursing staff to encourage the patients to call the office before they headed off to the emergency room. We also encouraged the office and the office staff to really talk to the patient, see if their situation could be resolved either over the phone or by having them come into the office, where we kept some staff available to see walk-in patients who had received chemotherapy, rather than putting them into the cycle of coming to the emergency room, being exposed to patients who might have acute infectious diseases, and then increased likelihood of being admitted. And with this campaign, we were able to find that most hospitals dropped by at least 50% in the likelihood of a patient going to the emergency room or being admitted to the hospital, both of which will be significant cost savers or revenue savers with the CMS regulations. The second program that I want to talk about is our Nurse Navigator program. Many patients, as you well know, are unable to absorb all of the information given to them about their diagnosis. It can be particularly difficult, especially in these days of COVID, when visitor restrictions, even to the office visits, have been profoundly limited, both in our system and in many others. And so we have been able to build a program where experienced and dedicated nurse navigators serve as patient advocates. Across the system, we have 38 nurse navigators. Their job is to really interact with the patients, preferably from the time of first diagnosis, and work with them through cancer surgery, if necessary, and certainly during chemotherapy and radiation. They also help set up appointments for specific treatment options, shepherd them through the visits with multiple different doctors, and actively participate and in fact manage our multidisciplinary cancer conferences and working with the patients who are suggested to come through our multidisciplinary clinics, where before COVID they could readily see a medical oncologist, radiation oncologist, as well as a surgical oncologist. We have fortunately been able to reopen most of these clinics now, but we unfortunately had to close them during the high-frequency days of COVID. So that the Nurse Navigator program we have found to be extremely well accepted by our patients. It gives significant patient satisfaction, and we find that it is a major engagement technique with the rest of our staff as well. At this point, I'd like to discuss briefly about how management changed during COVID. One of our biggest concerns has to do with the fact that during COVID, almost all of our screening came to a stop for between 3 and 6 months, depending on the disease we were screening for. Aurora had been in the position to dip their toe into virtual visits, and the plan was to do 25,000 virtual visits in 2020. Needless to say, we cranked this up immediately, and over 900,000 virtual visits were completed in the first half of 2020, with well over 1 million being done during the whole year. And we feel that ultimately this gave us a good experience to be able to continue the use of virtual visits as we move forward. What about cancer survivorship? That's obviously a very critical part of the continuum of care of cancer treatment. As we look at our merged partnership with Advocate, we find that between the two organizations, utilizing regular follow-up through our tumor registries, that we have over 156,000 total cancer survivors being followed. And hopefully when COVID is truly under control with vaccinations and other experiences, we will be able to have an event where we do fill both Wrigley Field in Chicago and American Family Field, which is the new name for Miller Park in Wisconsin. With our number of survivors, in theory, we could fill both of these parks two times each. So I know that we've talked about a lot of areas, we've given you a lot of information, but I do want to kind of sum up what we have found from the use of pathways and other things. We've shown that using reproducible, evidence-based approaches to cancer does reduce cost. It does reduce complications. It keeps patients out of the emergency room and avoids readmissions, and it allows us to move the field forward. We have now instituted pathways in our very active precision medicine program, and feel that this will be able to provide even enhanced cost savings in the future. By having multiple disciplines involved, standardization is really required across the spectrum, and we are now working on pathways and guidelines both in surgical oncology and in radiation oncology. And unfortunately, from the perspective of most physicians, as fee-for-service medicine continues to be phased out, greater emphasis is going to be placed on efficiency and quality. And these two areas can be markedly enhanced by the use of pathways. So that we feel that we've seen delivery of a more efficient and consistent evidence-based care across all clinics and locations. Our merged partners in Illinois actually went live in October of 2020, and our plan is to really be able to deliver most of these advantages across the Advocate healthcare system, as well as what we've seen within Aurora. They do give marked improvement in our clinical trials accrual. It has resulted in acceptable compliance from our medical oncologists and evidence-based pathways, and it does give us very good evidence-based data that allows us to move the field forward. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present this program to you today. And I'll now turn the floor back to Sonali.
Thank you, Dr. Weese, for sharing how oncology pathways have supported your delivery of evidence-based care across Aurora's vertically integrated cancer center. In listening to your talk, I took away three things. First, that pathways integrated into the EHR help standardize care and enable multidisciplinary approaches. Second, that pathways and other supportive programs can improve cost management and reduce avoidable emergency department visits. And third, that embedding clinical trials into your pathways reduces the time required to accrue patients to trials. Clinical Path is a leader in oncology pathways and is used by cancer centers nationwide. As Dr. Weese has shown, our pathways support physicians in their treatment decisions at the point of care. With Clinical Path, you can narrow the band of variability in care decisions with personalized multidisciplinary support for high-quality cancer center. You can understand your practice patterns at every level, from the network or practice site down to the individual physician or patient. And you can embed clinical research in your team's workflow so that trials are available ahead of standard of care therapies. If you would like to learn more, please visit our Clinical Path website or contact us at elsevier.com/clinicalpath. Thank you for your time, and I'll pass it over to Mackenzie and Dr. Weese for our Q&A segment. There are a lot of great questions in there.
Great, thank you so much, Sonali. And Dr. Weese, thank you for such an informative presentation about Aurora Cancer Care and pathways. We've had a lot of great questions already roll in for the Q&A session. If there is anything else you'd still like to ask Dr. Weese, please feel free to submit your question now by typing it into the Q&A chat box you see on your webinar console. Let's get started with the first question. This audience member is asking, with pathways supporting practice standardization, have you found this also provides you with a better predictability around cost, and especially drug costs?
We have, and we're particularly interested in that in the new precision medicine programs that are coming out. With drugs that can be as much as $30,000 to $50,000 a month, it becomes very important that we utilize them best in those patients who we think will best respond to them. But the answer to that question is simply yes, that by having pathways, we are able to we are able to define the best treatments, and in fact, our molecular tumor board also makes recommendations for individual oncologists to be able to select the best treatment for a given patient. So we've been very pleased with the success that we've seen in this area as well. I see there are a number of patients, a number of questions, Mackenzie, that come up asking about utilization rates. We get a printout on a monthly basis, and actually we found that by addressing the initial issue of how many different recommendations had been given to patients before we used pathways, that we were able to get a good head start to get our medical oncologists to follow the pathways. We run generally between 85 to 92% on pathway, depending upon the disease, because we get different, essentially different rates by disease and by pathway. One of the things that I have done is there are 14 disease-specific committees that are maintained through Clinical Path. Aurora has 7 of the clinical chairs on that pathway, on those pathways, and other organizations actually fill the academic chairs and the other community chairs. But when people come and say that they have a disagreement with pathways, I insist that they attend those meetings and present their case to the national committees. And in doing so, we've been able to get very good compliance with the physicians following the pathways, and in fact, oftentimes commenting that the treatments recommended were something that they weren't necessarily familiar with. The other advantage that we have, as you can tell with the large number of clinics that we have and the both urban and rural nature of Wisconsin, there are many clinics where we only have 2 medical oncologists, and for the most part, they're obligated to treat all different types of cancers. The pathways have really made it much easier for them to be comfortable treating those patients, and as part of the arrangement, there are also patient-faced information that can be given out to the patients, and in the pathways, which are fully integrated into the electronic medical record, they can click on the references and it immediately brings them to the reference to look up a specific study if they have questions. So we have found that our physicians have been most willing to follow the pathways, collaborate with the committees, and we really have not had a problem with people not following them.
That's great to hear. And we have another question from an audience member who says, it sounds like adherence to the pathways is high, but what percentage of patient treatments are being selected through Clinical Path?
Well, the pathways really give you 2 options. Whenever a new patient is diagnosed and then staged, they are then processed through the pathways. And we find that, again, somewhere around 85% of patients get the treatment prescribed within the pathway. One of the reasons why we actually had trouble getting the data for the on-pathway versus off-pathway comparison is it took a while to get a large enough number of patients treated off-pathway to be able to look at that data. So the numbers really are quite high.
Wonderful. Thank you for weighing in there, Dr. Weese. The next question is, were your pathway variance results displayed by physicians, and were the results transparent for all physicians to see?
Yes. We get a printout monthly by disease, by physician, and by practice, so that this data is shared with the physicians as well. And one of our medical oncology physicians, who also has an engineering degree, functions as the informatics medical director within the practice, and has been particularly helpful in reviewing questions and essentially working with and tutoring any physician who we find really, at least to start, has a low compliance with pathways. So that we've been very pleased with what they have been able to deliver to the practice and to the system.
Got it. That's helpful to know. Thank you. We have a question here more on the technology side, which is, does your EHR automatically interface with this pathway vendor so that updates are automatically flowing into the EHR?
Yes. Any of you who have an EHR probably have some of the same trepidations I do when we use the word automatic. But the pathways are intrinsic in the EMR, and the changes are made with the assistance of our IT teams really as soon as there are any changes in the pathways. So it really is about as flawless as I'm capable of directing it.
Wonderful. Thank you again for weighing in there. We have a question about the nurse navigators as well. The question is, are your nurse navigators assigned to the patient or to the program/MD? Do they follow patients over all locations and treatment?
Well, our navigators are location-based, and depending on the volume at a given site, as an example, at St. Luke's, which is our quaternary care center, our navigators are disease-specific. In our smaller sites, a navigator will essentially work with all new patients regardless of disease. So they are assigned to a given patient and work closely with them as well as with the physician taking care of the patient. They are really highly engaged with the patients and are felt to just be an extreme asset to the program.
Wonderful. Thank you again for weighing in there. We have a question about what the oncology care team looks like when the pathways are in place. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about that and whether you have disease-oriented groups?
Yes. We have disease-oriented quality groups that meet quarterly. The pathways are predominantly used on the medical oncology side. Again, all of our medical oncologists, as part of being part of our system, are asked to provide a choice of a primary and secondary disease of interest. This accomplishes a couple things. One, it provides even those physicians who are in the more remote areas to function as a resource for the rest of the system. And once they declare an area, we also ask them to do additional CMEs in that area so that everybody has really intrinsic value to the system. The other thing is once they choose a disease area, we ask them to attend those quarterly meetings with Clinical Path so that they are hearing about any late changes that they may not have picked up on their own, but also can weigh in on the decision-making of what's going to go into the pathways. So we find that our engagement in that area is quite high. And to be honest, I'm very proud of the fact that within the cancer service line, which is one of 10 service lines within the medical group, we tend to have the highest physician and advanced practice clinician engagement scores. So my own feeling is that these are well received and do facilitate providing excellent evidence-based care.
Wonderful. Really helpful to hear all that. So thank you for outlining that. We have another question here about compliance to the pathways. The question is, can you talk a little bit more in detail about how you monitor that compliance and hold providers accountable?
We, again, get a monthly printout from Clinical Path and can look at compliance within any specific disease site. I think that the fact that we do engage our physicians to take a focused interest in the development of the pathways, what drugs go into it, and they find after a period now of a number of years of use that they do tend to be truly evidence-based and accurate. So we have not generally had a problem with compliance with the pathways. Again, particularly in our more remote hospitals where physicians are likely to practice across multiple disease types, they find the pathways very helpful. And we have not really had a problem with encouraging them to use them.
Wonderful. Thank you for clarifying that. The next question is, how many MDs are a part of the various committees?
Are you asking about the clinical path committees, or are you asking about our quality committees, or are you asking about our tumor conferences?
Great question. You know, the question does not specify, so maybe you could give a brief summary of what you think would be most relevant.
Sure. Well, our tumor conferences generally have between 15 and 40 physicians of all disciplines. The quality committees have appropriate representation of physicians from multiple disciplines who specialize in that particular disease, and they run between about 15 and 25 people. And Sonali, you might be better off to answer the question about the clinical path committees. I haven't attended too many of them recently, but we generally found that they were usually attended by somewhere between 10 or 20 physicians. But Sonali, can you weigh in?
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Weese. I think that's exactly right. Our disease committees are chaired by an academic physician and a community physician. So we have co-chairs for each committee. The disease committee number of physicians varies by disease. Certain diseases like breast have a lot of physicians. But as Dr. Weese said, it's somewhere around the 10 to 20 range. The committees meet quarterly for medical oncology and twice a year for radiation oncology. They review the latest evidence. They may also meet more frequently if there's practice-changing patterns that come out. And following the discussion during the committee meetings, physicians are invited to vote. And then from there, the pathways are modified based on those voting results. Physicians vote on whether they want a change to be made to the pathways based on efficacy, toxicity, or cost in that hierarchical order. So only when two or more regimens are equally efficacious, we then look at toxicity and then look at cost from there.
Wonderful. I appreciate you both weighing in on that question. Thank you. The next question is, do the pathways include medication guidance and protocols?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, Mackenzie?
Absolutely. Do the pathways include medication guidance and protocols?
Well, again, pathways, unlike guidance, are really just that. They are protocol designed and protocol driven, so that there is a very definite algorithm of when a person is newly diagnosed, there are a series of questions that are asked as part of the staging, so that the treatment varies by stage. But in addition, with all the new markers that are available and the new treatments that are currently available, we go into whether there's been genetic testing on the tumor itself for mutations and how that might affect the treatment algorithm. So in guidelines, you really don't have those protocols. A guideline might tell you that XYZ drug is appropriate to use for stage 4 breast cancer. A pathway will actually recommend that the first treatment is a clinical trial. The second treatment would be the most efficacious and least toxic treatment. And the third would follow the algorithm of efficacy, toxicity, and then cost, if they're equal on each of the prior steps. I think that's the question that they were asking. But if I'm missing it, if you feel free to clarify.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Weese. We have a question here, seems like almost about the patient experience. The question is, are patients able to contact the office 24/7 with issues, or is this only during business hours? And if it's after hours, who answers the phone? A nurse, physician, etc.?
We use a central service that is developed and employed by Aurora. Many of the people who work at the service, which handles after-hour calls, are nurses. And in cancer, there are specific, there's always a physician on call, and if any question comes up, that would be almost immediately routed to that physician to answer the question. So it really is not a perfect system, but it's one that functions quite well and does give the patient access to a pretty high level of care very quickly. That doesn't mean we never refer patients to the emergency room when it's appropriate, but it does allow the patient to get pretty sophisticated advice very quickly. And if necessary, the patient would be told to come in. If not, they'd be given a recommendation. And if necessary, they would be seen first thing in the morning in the usual office that they work with.
Got it. It's helpful to hear that process outlined, so thank you. The next question is, what decision support system was used to determine your cost of the pathways you developed?
Actually, the clinical path itself calculates cost. When we did these studies, we actually looked at the patient records and took the cost as we, as they were added up within the patient records. In a system as large as ours, determining cost can always be a difficult process, but because we looked at the cost in the same way of the on-pathway rate and the off-pathway rate, we felt that it was fair. I think when clinical path determines cost, they look at average wholesale price. And Sonali, you might want to comment on that.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Dr. Weese. I also see a couple of questions in the Q&A section about whether this is a commercial product. And I just wanted to address that. So yes, Clinical Path is a commercial product. It is available through Elsevier, and you can see the contact information on the bottom right of this screen. Please feel free to reach out to us if you would like to learn more.
I see another question, asking about Advocate. Yes, Advocate switched from Cerner to Epic and did not go live in the oncologist's office until October of last year. But our plan with the agreement of Advocate and their medical oncology leadership is that we plan to standardize the use of pathways across all of the employed medical oncologists working in the Advocate system. Advocate has many more independent physicians than Aurora does, in that Aurora is significantly an employed physician model.
Wonderful. Thank you for adding that point, Dr. Weese. Another audience member said, I'm impressed with the research on the number of pathways you had. Lining them up to reduce that number likely wasn't easy. How was the actual process of consolidating done? Was that by a committee or a smaller group to provide the recommended care pathway? And was there any resistance with that process?
We made a decision to employ the pathways from a service line perspective and had a number of the medical oncologists involved in that decision-making process. So it really was not, not a terrific problem to get people on board. We also encouraged them to participate in the ClinPath committees. And again, as I mentioned, 7 of our medical oncologists serve as community chairs of those committees. So there has been very good compliance with the pathways.
Wonderful. Looks like we have time for about one more question, Dr. Weese. This one says, with Advocate Aurora treating 1 in 4 oncology patients in Wisconsin, how have pathways helped you ensure that each patient is getting the best care possible? Is there an anecdote or example you can point to?
I guess the best anecdote is our pathways are evidence-based, and the fact that in the last 8 years, our average new patient volume has gone from about 6,800 to 2019. We had close to 9,000 new patients. It dropped off about 7% in 2020, but I think that was pretty universal. So the fact that we are having much less out-migration from the clinic and much more in-migration from our competition, in my mind, kind of answers that question.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Weese and Sonali, I just want to thank you both again for such an informative presentation and for taking the time to answer so many of our audience members' questions. I'm sure they found this so helpful. I'd also like to thank Elsevier for sponsoring today's webinar. And to our audience members, thank you also for joining us, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.